Welcome to Sing for Science, the show where musicians and scientists talk about music and science. I'm your host, Matt White. Each week we'll talk about a song by our guest artist and how it connects with our guest scientist's area of expertise. Today's episode is the first in our Best Of series. With the help of my co-host and Sing for Science social media guru, Bailey Constas, we'll be revisiting some of Season 1's best moments. Today we'll be covering the first half of the season with MGMT, Norah Jones, Connie Britton, Renee Fleming, and Mac DeMarco. Bailey, thank you for joining me.
Of course. Happy to be here.
You have been on the inside almost as much as I have in producing this show. So what are some of your takeaways from these first few episodes that we did?
Yeah. The first season is really about surrendering to nature. And I think more than once, guests have said, nature wins.
What was that thing that you posted with Suzanne Simard? You posted something that, and I think the caption you used was nature always wins. What was she talking about?
Yeah, she was talking about how trees and old forests are super complex and how we are quite literally descendants of trees in the very long evolution tale of things. And she was talking about this idea that we are not separate from nature, and the trees kind of give us this gentle reminder that we're a part of them.
Yeah, and so let's listen to the clip from the first episode. This is the inaugural episode of Sing for Science, and it featured MGMT and forest ecologist Dr. Suzanne Simard. And this was one of the first episodes I was inspired to do because so many years ago when their song Kids came out, I was really drawn to one lyric in particular in the song where they talk about a family of trees. I found it so incredibly evocative. So I invited them on the show, and Suzanne was game to join. So let's listen to this clip where they're talking about the lyrics, how they came up with it, and then Suzanne talks a little bit about how her work connects to it.
So I've heard a lot of different ideas of what the song's about, but specifically about that chorus line, not much discussion. I'm happy to talk about it because I've been kind of trying to figure out what it means for a long time.
Yeah, please do. Let this be your forum to just riff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like you said about trees having human qualities, in this case, I was thinking about trees being very old organisms that kind of see humans' lifespans come and go. And it kind of like the idea that there was a group of trees that had a mutual desire to be haunted by a human ghost or something like that, some kind of quirky thing that a tree family decided to do. And I don't know how they ended up getting a ghost into their zone, but that was the idea, maybe.
So you guys were in Connecticut at Wesleyan when you wrote it?
We were, yeah.
Can I ask, was there like mushroom foraging in the wilds of Connecticut for you guys?
I mean, not in like the food, like edible mushroom foraging.
That's not what I'm talking about.
No, I mean, I think we foraged, psilocybin mushrooms from different college dorm hallways. Like we weren't going out into the woods to find them.
Right. But maybe once you had harvested them from a dorm, you might have ended up in the forest.
Yeah, we used to go,
that's for sure.
What was this? We would go to this place, Wadsworth Falls, a bunch of times.
And the Devil's Hop Yard was another little park that we would go to.
Oh my. God, everything is just so stark in New England.
It is. And very old and kind of haunted feeling.
I think that, people have this innate connection to forests. We're actually descendants of trees along the evolutionary pathway. And I think that even if you don't fully cognitively understand the origins of the song, I think that our own deep connections to trees, which are genetic and also cultural, and you talked about the mystery of forests, that's deeply cultural. And when I started doing my research in forests, it's because I could see that, forestry or the industrialization of forests was moving away from our deep, heartful connections to forests. And I think that as you described this sort of just a visceral outcoming of this song, that it came from your heart, your gut, it speaks volumes about really how we've moved away and now moved back towards a better understanding of forests. And I have to say that my own, as I grew up in forests in Western Canada, I was a child of the forest. I just grew up in them. And when I became a forester and was watched in like horror as we sort of flipped sort of our very basic understanding at the heart level of forest into something that made money and was part of the economic machine and was degrading our forests, I thought, that was what drove me to start asking questions about the family of forests. How did we become, how are we connected, and how did we become so disconnected, and how do we reconnect? The industrial way of converting old forests, which are complex systems of many, many trees and plant and animal species working together to create a beautiful system, into something that's very simplified and basically pared down to, those species and individual trees that are big and fast growing, that bring economic value. We've started saying, okay, we can grow a forest like that. And that's what I grew up in, what I became part of that industrial machine when I was a young undergraduate student and looked at this and thought, this is wrong-headed. But yeah, that is the philosophy. It's alive and well in the world today, and it underlies many problems that I think, if we step back and say, actually, this isn't how the forest works, that we can solve some of these problems.
So it's a monoculture actually invites disease into the forest. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. It's like diversity means that there's a variety of species and structures, and different species have different tolerances to pathogens, for example, or invading insects. Or so if you have a variety of species, if there is some sort of pathogen infecting a species, then other species will kind of take over and fill in those gaps. But also there's this, what I look at even more than that, is that there's a synergy between species, that they actually connect and communicate about their health, their pathogen loads, and they can increase their health. They can share resources to enhance the health of their neighbors. And this confers into, a resistance against diseases, that it reduces their vulnerability to these damaging agents. So diversity, just by a sheer numbers, just to recap that, from a sheer numbers perspective, if you've got many species, there's a low likelihood of something killing the whole forest. But at the same time, it's even more than that. It is the synergy between species that enhances the health of the forest. In looking at the disconnection between birch and fir and the disease among the fir, I wanted to know how we were severing that relationship and what was causing the disease. And I started looking at the mycorrhizas, these beneficial fungi, thinking the answer lay there. And I discovered in my inquiries that these fungi actually linked the trees together. And I had a hunch already, because there had been some primary work done in Europe, actually, where there were some laboratory study, a laboratory study showing that little pine seedlings could be connected below ground by their roots through these mycorrhizal fungi. And I thought, wow, if this is happening in our forests, in real forests, not just in the lab, this connection could be the starting point of the health of the forest. And so when I started looking, lo and behold, I found, and over the years confirmed using advancing techniques in science, from just looking to using molecular techniques and discovering this vast network of interconnection of trees, not just of the same species or the same age trees, but of different species and multi-age forests. And through this network, this fungal network, and you can think of it as like the internet, messages are passed between trees. And what I first started working on was, one tree that may be bigger or healthier would, and in this case, my birch trees were bigger and healthier than my fir trees, were sending more nutrition to these, sickly or not as healthy trees. And then as I looked more and more, I found that this resource sharing, if you think of things like water and nitrogen and the fertilizers of the forest, the phosphorus, that all of these things are moving back and forth between trees, and they're shuttling them around below ground. The effect being that the health of the forest has actually become balanced. So old trees will support young trees, for example, especially if they're of the same kinship. And that's where this idea of the family of trees, there is a scientific basis for that, even though in the song, Andrew and Ben might not have thought of that at the time, but their visceral connection to the forest, somehow that was drawn out of them. and we can get into that, but I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, this was a pretty mind-blowing episode because for those listeners not familiar with Suzanne Simard, she is well known perhaps because I think she had a very popular TED Talk. She coined this phrase in the 90s, the Wood Wide Web, that talks about how all the trees in the forest communicate and help each other regardless of species. She was also in the Netflix movie Fantastic Fungi about season 3 Sing for Science guest Paul Stamets. And it's just really fascinating knowledge that she has been able to assemble about how the forest thrives and how the forest depends on diversity. And I mean, what better case to be made for the variety being the spice of life.
Right, exactly.
And then so the next episode we did was Norah Jones and science journalist Sean Otto. Sean Otto was actually a big source of inspiration for Sing for Science. He wrote a book called The War on Science.
Wow.
He also, as you alluded to, I think he does say nature always wins, because this was recorded kind of peak pandemic. I mean, I think I recorded this in April 2020. And the basis of the episode was about embracing uncertainty and the importance of doing as much if you're a scientist. So we had Norah Jones talking about her breakout hit, Don't Know Why. So we connected those two.
One thing that we found through science is that the majority of the time, common sense is totally wrong and leads us in the wrong direction, because we fool ourselves all the time with confirmation bias. It's maybe the number one risk in science, is that you're going to make yourself see what you already thought that you would see or want to believe. And we all do that as humans, and science has taught us over and over again to reality check those gut hunches, because a lot of times they're wrong. And that's the only way, in fact, that science has helped us to move forward, is to get ourselves out of the picture with testing. And the only way you're going to create something new, and that means you don't edit yourself, you don't inject your own ideas into the process, because all you're doing then is sticking in your preconceptions about how it should be instead of actually seeing what is.
Yeah, I think that there is something about letting it out that makes sense. If you edit yourself because you don't like the way certain things sounds, and you never put it down on the paper because you think it's stupid, or you think, oh, this lyric kind of reminds me of another song, so I'm not even going to bother. Well, it's just like a scientific theory, right? You're never going to rule it out unless you put it down on the paper. What if it's the thing? I've written songs before that started out kind of one way. Maybe I didn't love them yet. Maybe they sounded a little bit too much like another song, but you have to see it through to the end. And then you realize you're in a completely different place. If you don't see things through and you don't follow the little path where it goes, you're not going to find out if you have a copycat song or if you have a brand new entity.
So have you ever gotten to the end and you just kind of followed this path and you have this kind of jangled heap of different stuff and you didn't know where it was going and you still don't really know, but you get to the end and then you figure out how to put it all together?
Yeah, I mean, usually that's the goal, but I think, sometimes you get to the end and you think, that's cool, but I don't really love it. But usually I feel like if you follow your heart, I mean, it sounds cheesy, but if you follow your heart the whole way through, and yes, you use your brain a lot, but you also keep it sort of centered in your heart and your guts, then when you get to the end, whatever kind of weird little thing it ends up being, it's special because you followed it there with the truest of intentions. I'm always just trying to find something, and I don't always know what it's going to be.
Yeah. And Sean, could you talk more about what you'd mentioned earlier about creativity as it concerns the creation of knowledge?
Creating knowledge is very much like creating art or any other creative pursuit. To a really great degree, you're fumbling around in the dark when you work as a scientist or an artist, feeling your way into something, and you don't know if your effort will be fruitful or not. Very much like artists, scientists work and work to learn and sharpen their craft, and they work to get comfortable with the unknown because they're in a daily relationship with it. And embracing not knowing is really the only way you're ever going to find something new. Thomas Jefferson was a scientist and a lawyer, like Francis Bacon, and he put a lot of thought into the role of evidence in science and democracy. His three greatest heroes were scientists. And he wrote to a friend in the 1880s, and he said, wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. And that's a really important notion that's gotten more important since then, because in a day and an age dominated by complex advanced science and technology, that means that in order to be able to govern ourselves using democracy, it's incumbent on each of us to embrace and support public education and embrace and support fact-based, evidence-based journalism, and to oppose their alternatives, because an educated public is the only hope we have of retaining a free public.
You know, I mean, that's one of the big takeaways for me from your book. You point out early on that the trouble with the way our legislature works is that some huge percentage of our government is made up of attorneys, trial lawyers who are trained to argue to win rather than look at all the data and try and arrive at a conclusion from that. It's the reverse. And so that's why whoever's loudest and talks the most usually wins.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, and it's or whoever is the most passionately convincing.
Yeah.
And that just comes down to the different ways that scientists and lawyers kind of approach questions of fact. Part of it is this thing that you're talking about, is this embrace of uncertainty. Because the scientist, in order to be successful, they have to be both conservative in that they have to account for and explain all the known information about something that they're experimenting on in a paper that they write on it. Or they could be shot down and embarrassed, and it could cut their career short. But they also have to be totally open to what's new, what's the cutting edge. And in order to do that, they have to say, all right, I'm going to put this out there. This is what I think, what appears to be happening. But here are the places where our research wasn't able to answer anything. And here are the possible ways that this could be disproved. And then they publish it and they leave it open to anyone in the world who wants to come along and try and knock it down. And a theory in science is only as strong as its falsifiability, as its willingness to be uncertain about its conclusions and allow anyone, all comers, to come and try and rip it apart. And if nobody can, then we have a pretty high degree of certainty that it's true.
Did you say something in your book to the effect of the closest that we can get to facts, or the closest we can get to truth, is evidence-based claims? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, for sure, because that is independent of all our biases. It's independent of our gender identity and our racial and ethnic and political and religious identity and our national identity. All of those sources of bias are stripped out because it's open to peer review and it stands open to criticism by anyone. And if it can still hold up, then we have a pretty high degree of confidence that this is objective knowledge. It's not reliant on our subjective opinions.
I mean, that one of the things that I found very moving was a quote from Walter Mondale that was on your book jacket, and it says, He says, evidence from science is one of the world's great equalizers because it forms an objective basis for public policy. This book illustrates how central that notion is to forming of modern democracy and how current attacks on science endanger our freedom. Policymakers and voters everywhere would do well to read The War on Science. How's that for a plug?
That's pretty great.
Yeah, it's a great plug. And it's so true. I mean, as we all see today, unfortunately, in this crisis, COVID crisis that we're dealing with, where we have political leaders who are really dismissive of and have been dismissive of the evidence. And ironically, here's the United States, who's the most scientifically and technologically advanced country in the world and stood to have the best outcome facing this crisis, and we're facing the worst outcome. And it's because we didn't base policy decisions on the evidence. So I'm feeling actually really hopeful, because ultimately you can be sure of one thing, is that nature wins. I mean, we can think all we want, we can argue all we want, but in the end, nature wins. And I was concerned that nature was going to win by us ignoring the climate crisis until we passed a couple of tipping points and we had methane disruption coming out of the Arctic Ocean, and that might have been introduced a cycle that we couldn't get out of. This is giving us a window. First of all, it's giving us a window and reduce emissions, but also it's giving us a chance to take a step back, to revalue what we care about in life, and to think about science as a force that we exercise love with, and not as some enemy that we can disparage.
The big takeaways in this one for me were, one, drawing the similarity between creating knowledge and creating art, about scientific pursuit, scientific discovery being inherently creative.
Absolutely.
And that's come up in other episodes. In season 2, we had famous climatologist Michael Mann and Debbie Harry, and we talked about how much creativity went into his iconic hockey stick climate graph. And then the other thing, the big one is confirmation bias, which is just something we all come burdened with, thinking that we know something, and that often turns out to be wrong. Also, as Sean pointed out in this clip, it's often the case that our intuition is misleading.
Yeah, and I think that is sometimes a difficult thing to get our minds around, because the couple of clips we just talked about were about trusting your intuition, but there is also this detachment from the outcome that I think the scientific method offers us. And I think that artists, musicians have, like he's saying, a constant battle with that unconscious bias of, well, I see what I want the painting to be right now, but I need to let that go so I can actually do it. And I think it's just really interesting to think about science as, it's just curiosity. We're just trying to figure it out, and our brains get in the way a lot of the time.
Yeah. So, third episode, we had Rivers expert Paul Goulet and Hollywood film star Connie Britton. I've yet to watch White Lotus. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't. I really need to.
No. So this was recorded pre-White Lotus, I think, but we were connecting this to her work on the show Nashville, because she had a song called The Rivers Between Us. So, Connie, in LA, do you see water conservation PSAs and efforts kind of always in your face out there?
Yeah, absolutely. We haven't been in a drought in the last few months. And, of course, we had a really terrible drought last year and terrible fires. And we actually were restricted from water use here at that time. And it feels very immediate. I've definitely developed a new sense of how valuable water is and how much we need to take care of the systems that bring us clean drinking water, certainly in this country as well as around the world.
Yeah. Well, so how did they enforce the restrictions?
Well, our water consumption was actually being watched. And if your water consumption and water bill went above a certain amount, you were charged fines and additional fees.
Gotcha.
You know, it's funny, in New York, back in the 1990s, when I was working for the state environmental department, the city of New York was using about 1.8 billion gallons of water a day. And there were no meters on the different apartments and the different apartment buildings. They just charged by the frontage on the block. And then the city required that meters go in, and they started charging per gallon. And the consumption went from 1.8 billion gallons a day to 1.1 billion gallons a day. That was how much water we were wasting. Wow. It was shocking. So sometimes a little efficiency is a good thing. And like I say, if you need water to have a thriving city or have a thriving agriculture or to have rivers that are cool enough to support a good range of fish and wildlife, then you really have to not waste what you got. And I think that's a very, very traditional notion that things are too precious to waste. We got away from that a little. You know, I'm a child of the 70s and conspicuous consumption and all that. I think that we're going to be better consumers if we take the conspicuous part out there. And certainly there's ways of reducing demand on energy, and energy and water intersect because you need the water to cool the energy plants. So I think we're getting better. I think we're learning some things. You know, there's the wastewater treatment plant in New York City that actually takes the methane gas that gets created during the water treatment and uses it to power homes. And that's pretty important.
I'll tell you, I learned that firsthand because we live a block from those giant eggs in Greenpoint. You know the ones I'm talking about, Paul?
Sure. There's a waterway in New York called Newtown Creek. Right. And just so people understand how industrialized this is, this just wasn't a home to one of the refineries in the Industrial Revolution. This was a home to the first refinery in the Industrial Revolution. And so it got dirty as hell, and it's getting cleaner. It's starting to recover. And there's an enormous wastewater treatment plant that makes sure that there isn't any more pollution than there has to be. And it captures that methane gas from that treatment and sells it off to National Grid or whatever company it is that provides natural gas to homes. So that's an amazing feat of engineering.
Yeah. Very romantic offering in New York City. You can go tour the sewage treatment plant on Valentine's Day with your partner.
On Valentine's Day.
Yeah. So I went with my wife.
Amazing.
It is. And these things are really a marvel to stare at, these giant eggs, and you go on top of them. I don't know. It's a good thing to do.
I've got to go check that out.
It's very cool.
I think having that awareness, though, getting back to what you were saying, Paul, the awareness of the fact that all of these resources are at risk of scarcity and pollution. And, you know, being in California where we were really face to face with the fact that we didn't have enough water was a new concept for me. But ultimately, it really has stayed with me. Every single time I turn on the sink, I think about where that water is coming from and the amount that I'm using. And I have that awareness even when I leave California now. And I'm grateful for that. And it sort of makes me think, oh, if we could create that awareness, certainly about water around the country, but also about all of the other environmental issues at hand, we could be so effective as citizens and humans.
That is really nicely said. That is so true.
Yeah. And to that end, how does conservation advocacy work with what you do?
So we have this cleanup day where we get, well over 2,000 people out to really connect with their waterway and to feel some pride of ownership and pride of care. That's one of the best ways to foster advocacy. We also have 180 volunteer community science partners who go out and do water quality testing. They take a sample in their local waterway. They find out how much bacteria there is in it, find out how much dissolved oxygen. Bacteria is bad for people who want to be in the waterway fishing and swimming.
What does dissolved oxygen indicate?
Dissolved oxygen is how much oxygen you have in the waterway to support your fish and other wildlife that don't breathe the way we do. So you need a decent amount of dissolved oxygen. Too little, and the fish can't live. Too much, and you get those toxic algal blooms, and you get situations in which, the waterway becomes unhealthy and choked off, especially in the summertime. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a Goldilocks thing. Don't want too little, don't want too much. But when you do this community sampling and you feel like you are getting to understand the chemistry of your waterway, things start to get really deep, no pun intended. Mm-hmm. And then you say to the government, look at all these people who are doing this work. They're doing shoreline cleanups. They're doing water quality testing. Don't you want to facilitate what they're doing with your own level of investment in our waterways? And I can tell you that just in the last 5 years, with this information in hand as to the areas where there's too much bacteria or too little dissolved oxygen, the state legislature in New York has allocated literally $3.5 billion for wastewater treatment and drinking water safety. And you can already see the reductions in pollution because we're investing in our waterways, and we're investing in our waterways because people are getting active. They're getting their feet wet. They're doing the water quality tests, and they're really showing that this is important to them. And they love it. And what could be better? I live about half a mile from the Hudson, but not a day goes by that I'm not either in the Hudson or right on its banks.
Something that I wanted to point out in this episode, both Paul and the science guest from the previous episode, Sean Otto, they both include an element of optimism. With Sean, he was optimistic in that nature can be relied upon to always win out. I'm sure there's a glass half empty take on that, but that was his. And then Paul was optimistic about how we are increasing investment in renewable energy.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very easy to be downtrodden by this sort of topic. So listening to him made me feel better. And it made me feel like it was possible to engage with this topic and care more about it. Whereas sometimes I feel when you get so afraid of something, you kind of just freeze up and you can't mobilize.
Yeah, 100%. You go full ostrich. Okay, next up, we have opera diva, probably the most famous opera star in the world, Renee Fleming. And Renee has made substantial investments in the intersection between art and science. She's worked with the NIH, and she's also done work with the Canadian doctor that joined us on the episode, Dr. Bin Hu. And Bin has done a lot of work trying to help Parkinson's patients. And there's so much to be learned about the relationship between music and brain health from Parkinson's patients. And in this upcoming clip, Bin talks about that. I think also in this upcoming clip, Renee talks about the Grateful Dead, which I didn't see coming.
Oh, yeah. And of course, the Grateful Dead are using, you'll hear it, they are using vibrations, tones to get their audience into a certain state. Yeah. And I think that's brilliant. I mean, why aren't we doing that on a daily basis?
Right?
Yeah.
Let's revisit this, baby.
Bin, what do you see if you're looking at the brain of someone who's performing versus someone who's listening to music?
I think Renee probably is the very few people who actually do have a brain image that when she was seeing. There was
the fMRI. Yeah, I have an experiment at the NIH.
Yeah.
So I was in the machine for 2 hours, and they took images of me singing, speaking, and imagining singing. And it's on the website of the Kennedy Center and for our Sound Health project. And it's really fascinating because imagining singing had the most powerful effect on the brain. It affected more parts of the brain.
Yeah.
And what do you attribute that to?
Well, the scientists who looked at were analyzing the images were surprised. And ultimately they said, well, okay, you're a singer, so singing for you is easy and you don't really have to think about it. So for another person, it probably would have been the strongest, garnered the strongest response. But for me, imagining singing took a little bit more effort because I had to tune out the sound of the machine, and then there were multiple repetitions and etc. So that was the analysis in the end.
I would imagine that's because there's some amount of muscle memory that's going on.
Absolutely.
So there was a study actually to look at the so-called muscle memory, whatever, of a pianist. So if you learn a piece of music, you play it on the piano, you remember it, and then you go back into the scanner. If you just purely play that piece you just played, that was exactly the muscle that control that fingers, that area is activated. So it's probably similar to a singer, the vocal.
When you go in and imagine it.
No, you just listen. You just listen to that piece. You just play.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, so it's automatically brings out the entire muscle activity when you play.
Wow. So a listening experience is going to be entirely different for a musician who perhaps has some experience or relationship to the piece of music than someone else.
Oh, I'm pretty sure if somebody did a detailed analysis with a group of singers, at the level of Renee, for example, there must be a very fundamental difference. For an accomplished pianist, so what we found out is actually there's way more white matter connecting the two sides of the brain.
What's white matter?
White matter is it's like fibers. Those are the wires that connect neurons. Okay, so you need those wires so that to send and receive the message.
And they only exist separating in between the two hemispheres, or is throughout the brain?
Whenever you have neurons that need to communicate to each other, they must go through the fibers, these axons, to send out the electrical pulse and then to release the transmitter. Okay, so there's long fibers, for example, from the cortex going to your leg muscle, and there's also short fibers just talking between neurons. So
could you talk a bit more about why it was you were inspired to assume this mantle of public health advocacy or getting more resources driven towards this intersection of music and science, and neuroscience specifically?
Well, first of all, it fascinates me as a musician. It's something you always, and singers, what we do is so complicated because we're using involuntary muscles. We can't even see what we're doing. It's internal. And so the mind-body connection was something I was very curious about from a young age, because at that time, medicine was kind of denying that existed. So in just those couple of decades now, of course, it's definitely accepted. But I felt like the audience, the general public, should know more about the health benefits of music for childhood development, for all of the therapies. Ben Hu's work with Parkinson's patients is so inspiring, incredibly inspiring. And the fact that he's developed an app that could treat, hundreds of thousands of people at once is amazing. So just to meet someone like Ben is to me extremely exciting, because it informs my work as a singer, and it's also something that I love to share with my audience, and they are fascinated by it.
Ben, could you speak to some of the work that you're doing with music and Parkinson's and the app you've developed?
Parkinson's responding to music is a phenomenon that was actually first, I would say, formally documented by Oliver Sacks. You know the name,
yes.
The Awakening, in New York. So actually we met in Calgary when he came here. So I talk about my work, and actually he was extremely interested. He asked me to carry on. So actually I did. In the past 15 years, this is mainly my work, music and the brain. in Parkinson's. It's called Ambulosono. It's a program where Parkinson patients, they put an iPod on their leg. So they start to walk. So they use their leg to bring out the music. It's almost like use your leg to play piano. This is actually, it's not like a speculative work. So there's a very solid science about how the music can affect the brain area that controls walking. Okay, so this connection from the music area in the brain to the area that controls walking is a phenomenon actually, and you can see when they hear a piece of music using the PET brain imaging, that area controls walking is light up, regardless whether you move or not. Okay, so we don't know why. But I suspect it's because of in the animal world, you can't see very much because of the trees or whatever. So the sound actually is the primary cue that you use to prey or to escape. So that's why this is a very old brain network. So what happened in Parkinson's is that, as Oliver Sacks noted, that some of these patients they can't walk, but they can dance. Actually, they can dance perfectly. A few years ago, actually, there was an earthquake in Italy. So there's Parkinson patients, they escape from their residence faster than anybody else. Okay, so then why under certain conditions, for example, like this called the motor urgency, or with music, they can move. This is just an anecdotal observation, but what we did is that we used this particular phenomenon to create a technology. So basically, you can use either an iPod or a sensor that wrapped on your leg. Okay, so the patients will walk, but you can set the size of their steps. So they only walk faster or larger steps, the music will play. Okay, so then they learn this and over again. So then their brain created a new pathway. Okay, so because we usually do not use our leg to control music, this is similar to a pianist. So you learn to play piano over time, your finger movement become very fluid. So now you put this music player on your leg, and then you use your leg to control the music play. So what we found out actually precisely as we predicted, there's the left side of the walking speed control area shows very dramatic change. This is after 6 months. What is more interesting is that all these patients, once they have gone through this over a period of 2 years, gait function and then their overall motor function improved dramatically. Okay, so their clinical progression seems slowed.
So you had observed that Parkinson's patients could dance without visible tremors. Is that the case?
Okay, it's not all of them. Okay, some of them, if they do not have their medications on,
right,
okay, they can barely stand up. They can barely walk. They can't. But once the music is on, they can dance, and with a perfect dancing step. Okay, so this is like a motor memory. If you ask these patients, you have to have the music they're really familiar with, and especially one we have been dancing with before. Music-related motor memory that is in their brain is permanently stored there. It doesn't go away when they have Parkinson's. So it's almost like a reserve.
And are you telling me that there is observable skill, like you wouldn't be able to tell that they have Parkinson's? They're dancing that well and that fluidly?
Some, few, not many. Okay.
There's a beautiful documentary. Mark Morris's dance and his dance troupe have started a program that's now international, and the documentary is called Capturing Grace.
Yes.
And it really shows how this works. And Ben Hu, of course, knows the science, and he's created something that can treat more people quickly. But these motor issues that develop with certain disorders can be treated really well with music. Again, if it's if it's this or if it's a brain injury or stroke, suddenly people can regain skill, and the music helps the brain make connections that it wasn't making. And it's really extraordinary.
Okay, very cool. So for our last episode, we had indie musician and all-around good guy Mac DeMarco, and he spoke with an acoustician. So we're talking about the physics of sound. The acoustician's name was Russ Berger. He lived in Texas, and he designs very, very fancy, expensive studios and spaces where we hear and make music. And in this particular episode, Mac kind of gave us an aural tour of his home studio. He built an echo chamber, and we talk a little bit about an echo chamber in this episode and what reverb is and what reverb does. A lot of fascinating things to be learned from the physics of sound. So
yeah, I think what was really helpful for me in this episode, I'm a very visual person, and having him talk about how tessellation, fractals, music, art, mathematics, they're all extremely related. Something clicked in my brain finally, and I was like, oh, sound waves. I get it. It's not just something we can't see. It finally made this auditory world so much more visual and clear to me.
Oh, cool.
Like, oh yes, these sound waves are things that are affecting us, and there are hertz levels that can make our arms vibrate, but that's a different level than what makes our lungs vibrate. It just made me understand sound so much better.
The risk of being pretentious, I'd like to quote a Samuel Taylor Coleridge poem in which he talks about experiencing light and sound and a sound-like power in light.
Wow.
That was before electricity.
Wow.
Yeah, that poem is the Aeolian harp. Anyhow, so with that, let's listen to our last clip. Bailey, thanks again for joining me. You've been an incredible co-host.
Of course, anytime.
There was a study done many, many years ago over in the UK where it studied a group of performers, rock performers, and half of them had hearing damage and half of them were just fine. They were playing the same band night after night, week after week, year after year. And it turns out the ones that had hearing damage, there was a correlation between them drinking and typically marijuana, but not hallucinogens or that, but drugs that sort of retarded your physical response. The smallest muscle in the body is called the stapedius muscle. It's a muscle in the inner ear, and it acts like a little limiter. So whenever it senses a really loud transient, it triggers and shuts down to protect the inner ear from loud noises. You've heard this if you've ever been, you've been on the front line and you got the drummer behind you whacking on the snare drum, and sometimes your ear will go into spasm where it goes, you can just feel it like shutting down and almost spasming. Well, that's the stapedius muscle. Well, apparently drinking heavily reduces the speed with which it can operate. It lets transients by, therefore hearing damage.
Wow, that's crazy.
So,
especially to think that usually when I'm playing a show, alcohol is part of the equation.
Yeah.
And that's probably the loudest place that I'm, usually in. Yeah. Well, no shows right now, but for the most, that's insane. Huh.
Well, you heard it here, folks. You got to ease up on the hooch.
Or just control your levels.
Well, we're about at the midpoint of the show, and Mac, I'm dying to hear the sound of the chamber of reflection, as it were, that you built in your basement. Could we get a taste of what it sounds like?
Sure. Let's see. There may be some strange sounds. The thing about the chamber is that it's not, it's a room down there, but it's not exactly perfectly isolated. So a lot of times when I'm recording, I'll hear a truck going by or birds chirping or a helicopter or something. So if any of those sounds come in, don't be alarmed. It's just, but let's try a little bit. I'm just running straight into it. Let's just bring that bus send up. Oh yeah.
Ooh.
That's the sound of my basement. That's nice. Oh, my mic gain is pretty high. It's got a pretty good tail, you know? Yeah.
Man. Russ, could you tell us a bit about what we're hearing or what reverberation is?
Well, reverb chambers are used for all different kinds of things in acoustical measurements, but they're also made, like a great example here of he made one himself where he's placing dimension and space behind his voice and other instruments. And typically reverberation time is what people refer to, and it's usually in a metric of RT60, where it's the time it takes sound to decay 60 dB, and it's usually measured in the 500 hertz band. And there are several things that affect reverb time: the volume, the absorption coefficients of the wall, the shape to a degree, but mostly that volume is the big dictator there. And to get longer reverb times, the walls need to be very, very smooth and reflective and hard. And it's best if the room is shaped optimally so that you're avoiding certain standing waves, which occur in any time a room is bounded, but build up when room dimensions hit on multiples of one another. But you're looking at that mean free path, the path for sound to make it all the way back around a room to the microphone. That distance affects the reverb time, but the volume is mostly of it. As you start making the room smaller, it starts developing certain characteristics that you can hear.
So is perhaps one of the reasons why listening to music with reverb is so pleasant is because it gives all these senses a run for their money?
It does. You hear reverb, and reverberation always sort of indicates, again, reverb is decay over time.
Right.
So when you have a transient in a room or an acoustical event, you have the initial transient and then you have the decay, and sound bounces around the room and returns back to you, the listener, and you have an impression of how big the room is, the size of it, the shape, what the finishes are, your placement in the room. Are you standing right next to a wall? You're out in the middle of the room. And this reverberation simulates that sound when you're out in a cathedral or in a church or in a large volume space. It simulates that. But the reverb is only coming in a stereo recording from the front,
right,
from two areas. So its ability to wrap around you and envelop you is limited. But again, our brain is so wonderful. It starts interpolating and leaving you with if you're just squinting one eye down and listening hard, well, then you're going to go, oh, it's only coming from up there.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're into the music and you've given yourself over to the experience, your brain will start filling in and creating that envelopment.
Oh, so do you know anything about how, when we were talking about the microscopic hairs on our face being able to detect higher frequencies, are there other parts of the body that correlate with certain other resonant frequencies?
Absolutely. The resonant frequency of the chest cavity is somewhere around 60 to 70 hertz. And if you'll notice, most consumer speakers, there's a big bump there. So, man, I really feel this in my chest, man. It's really thumping, man. Great bass. The stomach is around 4 to 8 hertz. Shoulders about the same. Lungs are kind of in that lower 5 hertz range. Hands and arms are up around 20, maybe 20 to 70 hertz.
And so that just means that structurally they vibrate harmonically, where they respond with that frequency.
Yep.
I mean, there's some frequencies that just hurt you. It's like, I mean, I'm not the kind of guy that's like, there it is, 5K. Like, I don't know, but it's like, when the sub is like so insane at some concert that you kind of feel like you're going to throw up or like, poop your pants or something, like that's crazy.
You know,
Isn't there something called the brown sound?
a brown note. Yep. Yep.
No.
Actually, that was Dr. Boner out of Austin, who was hired
No,
by
it's not.
NASA to.
There's no one named Dr. Boner.
Oh, yes. He was one of the. No, truly. He was one of the. And actually, there were two other acousticians named Boner, Richard and, Dick Boner. Yeah.
No way.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're putting me
Dr.
on.
Dr. Boner was famous. He's the one who invented equalization. Okay, he's the first one to tune PA systems with resonant coils. He's amazing. You can look in the literature on him. He was a genius. So anyway, they're afraid that from this, all the vibration and sound, incredible sound pressure levels that are there in a rocket launch trying to escape gravity, that our astronauts would void themselves.
Oh man.
But, they submitted people to almost 160 dB of sound from fractions of a cycle all the way up to about 50 hertz. And it did cause all kinds of problems. They had vision problems, made them nauseous. They had cognitive problems, working tasks. Motor skills were off and other effects and stuff. But there was no profound pooping produced.
Fair enough. Well, on that note, so to speak, it's about time for us three to wrap up. Mac, thanks for taking us into your basement. And
yeah, no problem.
Russ, thanks for giving us a good education on the physics of sound.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Mac. Great to be here.
Okay, take care, guys.
Yeah, God bless you.
Sing for Science is co-produced by Talkhouse and made possible in part by a grant from Science Sandbox, an initiative of the Simons Foundation. Stay tuned for other shows in our Best Of series, and be sure to check out our other episodes. For more information, please visit singforscience.org and follow us on social media @SingForScience. Thanks for listening.